Hi, everybody. How you doing? It's Matt Graham here on the King and Weber podcast. My guest today is a retired
Lawyer.
litigator,
Yeah.
with a specialization in constitutional affairs,
Mostly civil litigation, but I've got a degree in constitutional affairs.
and has served also, in addition to being a litigator, he's also been a professor of constitutional law at Laurier University.
For 2 or 3 years, yes.
Mr. Simon Adler. Simon,
hello, how do you do?
welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Now, in spite of all of that history that I just mentioned there, and that amazing resume, there's so many things that we could really talk about. But what I wanted you to come in here today to talk about is I wanted to learn more. You're the only person I know who spends time in Israel regularly.
Yes.
And I want to preface our entire conversation by first saying, I grew up in a small town of Strathroy, Ontario.
Yeah.
I didn't even meet a Jewish person until I was in high school. And I've never been to the Holy Land. I've never, Palestine or Israel, I've never spent any time there. I was once in Egypt, so I was close.
Okay.
But my knowledge that I carry today is only what I read in the news media and what I see on social media. And so I would consider my education and understanding of Israeli-Palestinian affairs to be limited.
Yeah, that's fair.
And so, I'm admitting my ignorance. I don't want to go on and pretend like I'm some sort of an expert on this issue.
Okay.
But I do know what the media reports. I do read that.
And that's the problem. No, that's exactly the problem. I'm glad you, in a sense, acknowledge that, because the media picture is quite different from reality for the most part. Not every newspaper is like that, but altogether too many of them. And so
I've tried to cast a broad net when I do my reading. Like I read from, for example, I read our local paper. Right. I read the National Post.
Right.
I read occasionally the Globe and Mail. The Free Press, which is a New York publication founded by Barry Weiss.
Yes.
I read that regularly. I follow the President's Daily Brief online, which is another great
story.
Yeah, it's a story, but these are just some of the sources that I choose to look at.
Yeah, and that's probably a reasonable selection. If, for example, you're reading many of the English newspapers, The Star, listening to the BBC, CBC, listening to some members of our parliament, you're just getting Hamas propaganda.
When I compare them, it certainly seems that way.
It is that way. And it's really unfortunate. We can talk for hours about particular examples, but the most egregious example of that was shortly after October 8th, I think it was last summer actually, no, not so shortly after, there was this allegation that a hospital in Gaza had been bombed. Mm-hmm. All the headlines were, Israeli forces bombed this hospital, 500 dead, so on. It was raised in the House of Parliament. The Prime Minister raised it and assumed that that was all correct. 2 days later, the pictures came out of this. It's a little fire-scorched parking lot, and the damage was done by one of their rockets. Maybe some people were killed. They might have been sitting in their parked cars at the time. The hospital was not damaged. The 500 deaths just didn't occur. It's that kind of thing. You don't get retractions adequate.
No,
when that happens.
Retractions are always much smaller than headlines.
Exactly. And even when they are made, they're not adequate. So let me say this, that going back and forth to Israel as I do, you get a different picture, a very different picture.
Well, let's talk about that just a little bit, because just so everyone knows, you have a home in Israel that you winter in. Is that correct?
That's basically it. Since my wife and I both retired, we tend to go to Israel for the winters and Canada for the summers, the best of both worlds.
Trying to get the best. But when you're there, what is life like in Israel today for the average citizen or the average retiree, we'll say?
Let's start pre-war and after the war, because we covered both times. Before the war, there was a certain level of stress, always. It's a stressful society, mostly because everybody hates the politicians, and the politicians do their best to deserve it. But so the society is stressed. People are very, very busy, very active in terms of trying to make their careers go, take care of the kids. It's a very busy busy place.
Sort of typical Western society.
Very much so. Bearing in mind that the majority of the country now, the citizenry, are not what we would think of as typical Westerners. If you add up all of the Russian immigrants, plus all of the refugees from Arab lands and all of their descendants and so on, they form a majority of the country.
Oh, really?
Now, yes.
Okay.
The sort of the Western European Anglos are still a huge proportion, but no longer the majority that they used to be. So it's got a bit of a flavor, a Mediterranean flavor that's different from New York. North America is what I meant to say.
But would it compare to, say, Western Europe?
Oh, in many, many ways.
Like an Athens or a Rome?
Yeah,
would a Tel Aviv or a Jerusalem, obviously not historically, like there's different historical things, but just from a day-to-day life perspective, does it have that Western European feel?
Okay, it's still, economics are still largely Western European. The very first time I went to Israel in 74, they were still in the habit of taking an afternoon siesta from 2 till 4.
Well, it's hot.
Well, it's hot, but but the point is that the economy has become significantly more Westernized. And
air conditioning is also probably improved.
Air conditioning has improved. You're absolutely right. And so basically the life is, for most people, quite affluent, but it's a struggle. They have to work hard for their affluence. I think that's the best way of describing it. And they do work very hard there. It's basically, for most people, it's a 5.5-day work week. For many people, it's a 6-day work week. And for some of the luckier ones, it's a 5-day work week.
What is is Friday night the big night off, the Shabbat?
Okay. Yeah, Shabbat starts at sundown on Friday. So basically things stop sundown on Friday and until sundown on Saturday. But more and more, the country is tending to close government offices, many businesses on all of Friday. Kids go to school for just half a day on Friday, for example.
Okay. But Sunday, everything opens back.
Yeah, everything's open on Sunday.
Okay. Yeah. I see. And so life is hardworking, people are diligent and conscientious.
And with all of that, it's just a wonderful place to be. Growing up as a Jewish kid in Canada, always enjoyed Canada to the extent I was old enough to know what that meant. But I've always been happy in Canada, but I've always been a minority. And I've always felt like I was just the 1 or the 2 or the 3 in my school, in my class, and so on. It wasn't until I hit university, U of T, and I started to meet lots of Jewish kids and start to see that there were many in Toronto. You go to Israel, and I'm home in a sense. I mean, I have 2 homes, and I don't want anybody to misconceive. I love Canada, and I really appreciate it, absolutely. But just like you can love your house in the city and you can love your cottage, I can love 2 places.
I can completely understand that. Yeah. My wife's family has a home in Greece, and it's up in the north of the country, and it's just a little mountain village, little shepherding village. But yeah, I feel just as home there when I go. But I don't think that makes me any less Canadian.
Exactly. That's the point I'm trying to.
Have you ever worked in Israel?
I've never been employed.
Okay.
Now, back in 74 and 75, and I think 76 as well, if I remember correctly, I volunteered on a kibbutz to do agricultural work. That's what kids did in my generation back then. And since the war started, I've done a lot of volunteering in agricultural work because the foreign workers disappeared. Basically, once the war started, the Palestinians were no longer allowed back into Israel, and all the Thai workers disappeared. And my wife and I, this last year, have done a lot of it. Picking fruit, it's lovely. It's lovely. It really is. We've both had very intellectual careers all our lives. I was a lawyer. She was a doctor. And to get out there and just work with your hands in the fresh air, with the smell of the trees, it's just
What
lovely.
fruit are you picking?
We picked clementines, oranges of several different kinds, and grapefruits primarily.
So citrus.
I did try strawberries. I didn't like that too much bending. I'm too old for the bending. Yeah. And we did red chili peppers, which were kind of fun. That was kind of
Don't
fun.
rub your eyes.
Exactly. Good point. Wear gloves.
Wear gloves. Don't rub your eyes.
Yeah.
That's amazing because that's really hard work for someone of any age, let alone a retiree.
Yeah, it's so much fun. It really is nice.
Great.
Yeah, like we do maybe anywhere from a 2 to 4 hour shift, basically, relatively early in the day before it gets too hot. And by the end of it, I've had my exercise, but it really helps the farmers out. There's a huge need for that kind of assistance because all of the think of it as if all of the agricultural workers suddenly disappeared out of California, or even St. Thomas
potentially
area.
Happen.
Right. Yeah, it's a huge dislocation.
Yeah. And it's going to cause a disruption. If no one harvests the crops, then there is no harvest.
That's right. There's no harvest. The farmers don't get any money, but the stuff doesn't get to market.
Precisely.
So people don't have what to eat.
Precisely. I get it. Yeah. Now, what is life like as a typical citizen in Israel post October 7, 2023?
Yeah. Okay. So it was traumatic. It's really hard to describe it adequately. On October the 7th, the single biggest massacre of Jewish civilians took place since the Holocaust. And there is no question it was a deliberate intent to massacre as many civilians as possible and to kidnap as many as possible to hold as hostages. So the deliberate genocidal intent of it was really incredibly shocking. And then that trauma was compounded as the days continued and Israel observed the reactions of the United Nations, for example, the Western nations, and the demonstrations on the street, most of which seemed to have been planned before October 7th. But in any event, the trauma of the October 7th brutality was increased and exacerbated by the immediate, so it appeared, within days, literally, but immediate turnaround. So instead of Israel being considered the victim of genocide, which it was, immediately the language in the newspapers was Israel's being accused of genocide. And you see the International Court of Justice making that accusation. So the country was really very, very traumatized. Individuals were really very upset, uncertain. Nobody really knew what was coming. Everybody knew that Iran was behind the whole thing. That's just not news. That's reality. And people didn't know whether Iran was going to jump in and start attacking as well. Within days of October 7th, instead of being a localized war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, the Houthis had started sending rockets and Hezbollah had started sending rockets from the north.
Well, that's what I'm curious about. Really, like, I can't imagine, to live in a country that's surrounded by enemies. Mm-hmm. So literally all of your neighbors don't like you.
Right.
And not only do they not like you, they shoot rockets at you. Like, what is it like to be in a country, to be living in a country where literally rockets can fly into your city on any given day? What does that feel like?
Well, it is terrifying, as anybody would expect. Okay, there's no pretense. But most Israelis would rate that very, very distant second to the joy of living there. Okay, so it's our home. We have no alternative. We have no other home anywhere in the world. And it's very, very clear and becoming really proven by October 7th and the mass reactions of otherwise ostensibly credible people that Israel certainly, and Jews generally, aren't entitled to the kind of comfort in the world that we thought we were. Okay, when you have the leader of the Green Party in Parliament in Canada hysterically claiming that only Netanyahu is the reason there's a continuing war, when you have the Prime Minister, Trudeau, accepting as a basis for decision making that Israel should not be entitled to buy arms in Canada, even though it's only transportation equipment, and yet saying Israel has a right to defend itself, you see a level of hypocrisy that is extremely worrying. And so that added on to the insecurity. It's interesting, shortly after, I think it must have been November or December, just as a matter of interest, I wondered if songs had started to be written, because Israelis tend to do that. They write songs during the wars. And I got a playlist from Spotify, and it was interesting that of the dozen or so songs that Spotify had, roughly half of them were mourning the losses and the tragedy, and the other half were very strong claims of eventual success. We are here, we're not going anywhere, we're going to do it.
Putting our foot in the ground, and we're holding.
That's right. There's strong confidence, self-assurance, and a plan to just carry on and succeed. And so that quickly, I think, became the predominant atmosphere there. So everywhere you went in the first year or so of the war, you'd see signs saying, "Together we will overcome." And that was, in a sense, the slogan that people used to say that we will succeed in the war. It's taken much longer than I think anybody expected, much longer than anybody hoped.
Oh, no question about that. I mean, the fact that it's still going on, we're here in June 2025. Yeah. We're a long way from October 7, 2023.
Exactly. But there have been, in any objective measure, huge successes. And so, there remains very strong reason to hope that it might wrap up fairly soon.
How do you feel about the fact that history gets distorted? I think about something in particular that I've read.
Yeah.
And you said, this is our homeland. I feel home here. We have nowhere else to go. A lot of people I don't think understand, and I've only read this in books, but again, after World War II, Jews weren't eliminated solely from Poland and Germany.
No, it was anyone they could get. France, Belgium, Holland, Italy, Hungary.
And Jews had also thrived in Morocco, in Tunisia.
Yeah. So what you need to, you're touching...
there's been so many expulsions, for lack of a better word. I'm looking for
that is the right word. Okay, so...
Where the Jews have been just expelled out of these countries. We think of them as Islamic nations now. Yeah. But once Jews thrived in these countries.
Absolutely.
Sephardic Jews were all throughout North Africa.
Absolutely. And all through what was then Persia and Iraq and all of that part of the world. So the first expulsion of Jews was, in fact, in England in around 1100. And then there were other expulsions in Spain, Portugal, and so on in the Middle Ages. And then, of course, you get the Holocaust in Germany. After Israel became independent, then there were pogroms and riots and deaths and attacks throughout all of the Arab lands against Jews. And so roughly 800,000 had to flee. Most of them ended up in Israel, and others were accepted in other countries, because by 1948, most Western countries, including Canada and the United States, had started accepting Jewish refugees again. Mm-hmm. They didn't during the World War II. So these people, the refugees from Arab countries, formed a very significant but very impoverished portion of the country, because they've been living in tents basically for years.
Wow.
Now they have been fully integrated, And part of what some people call the rightward shift in Israeli politics over the past 20 or 30 years is represented or caused by these people coming into political, I don't want to say control, but political activity. Okay.
They're more democratically involved.
Yes, because for years and years and years after 1948, the objective was to make a living, okay, put food on the table. Now the kids are going to universities and so on, and so they're getting more politically involved and expressing themselves, and they've got very definite agendas.
So what are those agendas?
Well, there's a story that Jews like to tell because it's very, very true. There are two Jewish guys stranded on an island. Okay, the boat collapses. Okay, eventually, United Israel Appeal finds them because one of them hadn't paid his pledge yet. When they get to the island, they find 3 synagogues. One that this guy goes to, one that guy goes to, and one that neither of them will be seen dead in. Okay, to suggest that any group of Jews has one particular idea beyond, for example, in Israel has to exist. Mm-hmm. Once you get beyond that level of generality, it's all over the map. So I'm not prepared to say that I can tell you in a definitive way what Sephardim want in Israel beyond respect, equality, opportunity, and just general advancement.
They want to be part of the democratic process.
Some of them are extremely religious and support the extremely right-wing religious parties, and some of them are really quite leftist and support left-wing, almost socialist parties.
How does that translate here into Canada? So I think about a city like ours here in Kitchener.
Yeah.
We have a Jewish population of, I don't know how much.
Well, some estimates say about 2,000.
So we've got about 2,000 Jews in the area. We've only got one synagogue.
Actually, don't.
No? Sorry, no. Here I am. See, this is
okay,
my
you've got
ignorance.
You've got one synagogue in Kitchener.
Yes.
That's the one on Sterling, Beth Jacob.
Yes.
Then there's a Reform congregation in Waterloo that shares premises with a church called the Cedars on, what's her at? Not Columbia, one over. Anyway, Herb Street, I believe. Okay. Yeah, it backs onto Herb Street. And then around the university, there's what's called a Chabad house, which has a Chabad affiliated rabbi. They're servicing primarily students, young professionals, and the population at large. Okay.
Oh, so there is options. Okay.
Oh yeah, there are options, but the number of people actually members of the two synagogues, either Beth Jacob or the Reform Temple, is relatively small. Together, they're still a minority of the total population. And there are a number here who are just not affiliated with any institution and do go to the Chabad facilities if, as, and when they find something interesting there.
Okay.
And the reason for that is we have a fairly significant number of Russian expatriates, who came to Canada when they were allowed out of Russia. And we have a reasonable number of Israeli expatriates. And neither of those two groups, the Israelis being primarily secular ones, were accustomed to synagogue membership. And so life goes on as it did.
Couldn't help. I'm just curious. Again, This is pure ignorance. I don't know enough. I know the Beth Jacob synagogue.
Yeah.
But I didn't know about the other one. So thank you for letting me know. Now, let's get back to Israel and just life in Israel quickly. Since I believe 1990, it's been part of the building code that every home must come have a bomb shelter in it. Is that correct?
No, not quite, but close.
It just seems so foreign.
Originally, after 1948, bomb shelters, communal bomb shelters, were built all over the place.
Okay. After
the Iraqi war, when Saddam was feared to have chemical weapons and launch Scuds against Israel, so that's late 70s, I guess, early 80s. Then it was determined that every building had to have some sort of a shelter. And then later still, I believe it's 79, but I don't really know. The requirement in the building code was that every apartment or every housing unit had to have its own safe room in it. And so I think everything since the 80s has one of these rooms.
I just find that so like, I just can't imagine sitting in my living room and looking over to the corner of my house and saying, that's my bomb shelter if I need to run. Because we're so blessed and we're so fortunate here in Canada that the idea of a foreign adversary bombing us is completely foreign.
Exactly.
And so I just couldn't imagine what that would be like. I suppose, like everything, you get used to things.
Well, okay.
You adapt, but
our apartment has 3 bedrooms, one of which is the safe room.
So it doubles as a bedroom.
It doubles as whatever you want to do. Before the war, a lot of them were just plain storage. Okay, that got fixed.
Well, that's not very helpful.
Exactly. But I mean, we've always used ours as a kind of a study and an overflow bedroom if needed. Mm-hmm. And that's probably what most people do. And it just gets integrated into the house. The only obvious differences between it and the other bedrooms is it has an extra huge metal door to close it off. It has a ventilator system that's unique to that room. And the window has a huge metal slider that you can bring across to close it off.
Oh, see,
but
my North American brain, I couldn't help but think of like the nuclear bomb shelters that were built in the 50s and 60s around North America.
No. The big communal things used to look like that.
Okay.
Yeah, they're underground and they have a big slanting staircase to go in. And there used to be one down near the Grand River here.
There's one not far from here, but they use it for parking equipment, but it's still a bomb shelter.
Yeah, okay, so that's what they used to look like.
Okay.
And now, I mean, you look at, and if you don't notice the door, if you don't notice the ventilator hanging on the wall, if you don't notice the metal slider, you won't see it as different from any other.
If I ever come visit, that's the room I want to sleep in, okay?
No, you don't. The air conditioning isn't the best in that room. So.
That's not my primary concern.
No, I mean, look.
I'm trying to make light of a very difficult situation.
I get it. But underlying that is an impression that I want to change if I possibly could.
Okay.
Except for the past 12 or 15 days. As a general rule, Israel is seriously not an unsafe place. Okay, even with everything that Iran could throw at Israel, I mean, it's still too many, but it was only 24 people killed and only a few hundred were injured. Now, I mean, I don't want to minimize that, but compared to what they were intending and trying to do, that's insignificant.
This is one of my arguments when I think of this Palestinian conflict and Iranian conflict as well with Israel. Quite often we hear about the buildings being demolished in Gaza.
Right, yeah.
See, what I don't see, here's what, I'm trying to put this as plain as possible. Yeah. Israel gets blamed for bombing buildings all the time.
Yeah.
It's not as though their opponents aren't trying to. They're just not doing a good job. Like the Iranians are bombing, Hezbollah's bombing, the Gazans, everyone's sending rockets into Israel. They're just not landing. And so it's like people don't seem, like, I don't understand. It's not that they're not trying to kill Israelis, they're just not good at it.
Well,
their military isn't as equipped.
You're absolutely right. And that's the thing that gets Jews so very upset. The double standard.
If those rockets were landing daily, because I can't even put a number of how many thousands of rockets have been shot at Israel in the last couple of years alone.
Yeah, it's literally thousands and thousands.
The fact that they're not landing for some reason gives them credit. Like, they seem to get away with it. Like it's not a big deal that they're shooting rockets at you. I don't know.
You're hitting on exactly the propaganda issue. That's the problem. It's an attitudinal issue, which quite frankly is most evident typically the further left you go on the political spectrum in the West. The idea that because Israel has a phenomenal defense, just as an aside, do you remember when we were much younger, Ronald Reagan wanted Star Wars? He wanted to...
Yeah, I was a child. You have to understand.
Oh, okay, well, I'm a little bit older. Okay, never mind. Everybody
But
laughed.
I do remember the Star Wars conversation.
Yeah, yes. Everybody laughed at him. It was ridiculous. The Israelis made it work. Okay, that's why there haven't been these mass casualties, because I'm not going to venture a particular percent, but probably well in excess of 90% of all of the missiles that were sent against Israel were destroyed before they got to Israel. Now, the problem that Israel faces is that too many people are too ready to reverse the reality of aggressor and victim. And that is derived, in my view, I'm not a sociologist or a political scientist, but to me it seems that the left has bought into a view that the world has to be divided amongst oppressor and oppressee.
We're seeing this taught everywhere, yes.
Yeah, exactly. And once you're labeled as an oppressor, nothing you can do is going to be right. And anything that the oppressee or the victim, suppose, does is going to be legitimate. So I remember once, many, many, many years ago, I was having a debate with a couple of other politicians, a couple of politicians anyway, and there was an audience. And at one point, I made a point about how horrible the then Intifada bus bombings were. Mm. And a woman in the audience said, well, we have no other alternative. Now, that's not a logic that's acceptable in the slightest.
I agree.
But yet it is when you get the guy who just won the Democratic primary in New York saying the Intifada must come international. I can't remember exactly what his phrase was.
Globalize the
Intifada. Thank you. He's talking about bus bombing. That's what he's talking about, as if that's somehow legitimate under any circumstances.
And remind people what Intifada means.
Well, it depends who you listen to. In terms of practical reality, Intifada was a deliberate period of murdering Israeli civilians. Bus bombings, they bombed hotels, they bombed weddings, they bombed suicide bombers, a lot of shooting. A couple of thousand Israelis were killed over the Intifadas.
Sounds like terrorism.
It is terrorism. It is absolutely. Except it's absolutely meaningless terrorism, because nothing's going to change because of it. No Israeli is going to change a policy because of it. Israel's not going to disappear because of it. And so it was absolutely meaningless, just murder for its own sake, in effect. And but you'll find people apologizing for it as saying, well, Intifada means struggle or something of that nature. And I don't care what they say. What they do defines the word.
The actions seem to define the word.
Yeah.
Now, how much this is, this is going to upset people, but I'm going to say it. How much do you think voting determines people's motives, politicians' motives when it comes to this? And what I mean specifically is, we just brought up the fact we live in a city that's approaching 700,000. The region is approaching 700,000 citizens. You just said there's a community of 2,000 Jews here.
Yeah.
We've had mass immigration into this country and into this city in particular. And the Islamic population far outweighs the Jewish population at this point.
Yeah.
And I can't help but wonder, because I'm a political strategist thinker, that's just the way my brain works. How many people are supporting the Palestinian cause, politicians in particular, federally, provincially, municipally, because of votes?
Oh, I think there's one argument to suggest that that's the way democracy ought to work. I think that's wrong, but Minister Joly stated, when asked a question about the Liberals' indescribably bad, hypocritical support of Israel, and she said, have you seen the demographics of my constituency?
So she admitted it.
Yes, she admitted it.
It's not a matter of right or wrong in her opinion there. It's
a matter of votes.
I've got to get these votes.
So there is, let's be fair, there's a theory of democracy which says the majority rules and the majority ought to rule, and whatever the majority says is right. We're seeing that being argued in Israel before the war, and much less since the war. That's what those demonstrations were about. The present government in Israel thinks we have a majority, we can do what we want. But there's another theory of democracy, which is that the prospective leaders need to present policies that are for the good of the country, not merely to get elected. Long-term policies more than short-term policies. And
those policies should be in alignment with our Constitution and our Charter of Rights and Freedoms.
And basic concepts of what the country's about. Absolutely. I agree with you. So that's the conflict I see brewing here much more politely, but it's the same conflict that's happening in Israel very, very rudely.
We also can see the negative impacts of this type of thinking, though, in England.
Yeah.
Where we've got this massive scandal with grooming gangs.
Yes.
And politicians refuse to speak up, refuse to take action for fear of losing votes.
Well, and because they don't want to be
or being
portrayed
labeled
as racists or something of that nature.
It was literally just yesterday that, like, a person stood up in Toronto City Council and labeled another councillor a bigot and a racist.
Yeah,
and this is a constant fear. Rather than having a dialogue like you and I are having. Maybe I disagree, maybe I don't, maybe I agree. We're talking it out rather than saying racist, bigot, conversation over. How dare you?
Yeah. No, that's
Islamophobia. This is or anti-Semite. Both words can cause huge issues. It prevents the conversation from moving further.
I am trying to stop myself from using for accusing people of anti-Semitism. I'm trying to stop because it's not helpful.
It doesn't solve anything. It just puts a stop to the conversation.
Exactly. But if you describe the behavior and say, do you think this behavior is right? Do you think it's fair? Then you might get some progress. There's no question in my mind that a great, huge percentage of those people who call themselves pro-Palestinian are really just anti-Jewish. Anti-Semitism.
Well, I'm going to say something controversial. This might upset you, but I want to. It's something that I think of, and because it is something that bothers me.
Yeah.
When we look at this conflict between Hamas and Israel right now, in terms of destruction and casualties at this point, perhaps there's more Hamas or Palestinian deaths. But in a strange way, I feel like they're winning this war, and what I mean by that is, this conflict, for some reason, unbeknownst to me, has made it completely acceptable for certain people to be anti-Semitic. Okay. It's made it commonplace to speak poorly of Jewish people and of Israelis in general. And that is something in my lifetime that I'd never witnessed before.
Okay, and I think you're absolutely correct. You're not going to upset me by saying it. The fact that you're correct upsets me and worries me. But no, it's absolutely, that's a point I was trying to make a little bit earlier. Didn't finish where I was going. The eruption of activity directed at Jews and Jewish institutions outside of Israel since October 7th demonstrates that it is in their minds that it is legitimate to punish Jews anywhere for something Israel does or doesn't do. That is a clear example of terrorism, and it's also anti-Semitic. But to say that to them is not going to get them to change their position. If you talk to them about, do you think it's fair to blame, for example, Giorgio, who lives down the street here, came from Russia years and years ago because Putin is attacking Ukraine. Do you think it's fair to go and blow up his gas station?
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, they're going to say no. So why is it fair to shoot at a Jewish girls' school in order to control what Israel does?
I was watching a clip last night of Gad Saad. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Gad Saad. He's a Lebanese Jew.
Oh, yeah.
Canadian.
Okay.
Born in Lebanon, emigrated to Canada, Jewish family, professor at Concordia.
Okay.
But he was talking about he's in exile. He can't even live safely in Montreal right now.
Oh, yeah.
Literally hiding out in the United States for fear. But he was talking about cognitive dissonance.
Mm-hmm.
And this idea that once people become entrenched in an idea, their willingness to let go and open their minds to other points of view and to other sides completely is cut off. And there's nothing that you can say.
No, that's true.
And there's literally nothing you can say. And so this idea that this is the Israelis' fault has taken hold with a large group of this country, and that at some level, it seems some people would say all Jews are to blame. The people on that side, not my side.
Yeah, I understand. Don't worry.
I want to you got to be very careful with what we say here, right?
Yeah.
But this idea that it's a commonplace thing to just blame Israel, hate Israel. You were a professor at Laurier.
Yeah.
How does it feel to be a Jewish professor at Laurier and to see protests on the campuses here in this city, anti-Israeli, camping out on University of Waterloo campus?
Okay, I've got to back up a couple of.
Okay, so maybe I would jump a little bit.
Just a second. You keep calling me a professor. I wasn't. I was a lecturer, part-time lecturer.
Pardon me.
Okay, yeah, no problem. And when I was at it was actually Wilfrid Laurier.
I said Laurier.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. When I was at Wilfrid Laurier, I didn't see anything that disturbed me in the slightest back then. I mean, so this is 82, 83, 84, somewhere around that. Nothing at all. When I was at U of T back in the early 70s, the newspaper the student newspaper would standardly run anti-Israel type articles. And I and everybody else I knew completely ignored it. It just was irrelevant, okay? Because it didn't translate into any significant behavior in those days. And that's the huge difference now. This translation of attitude into behavior is extremely, extremely disturbing. I want to tell you, just take a little sidestep.
Sure.
Back again in the 70s and 80s and into the early 90s, I was very active in what was called the League for Human Rights of B'nai B'rith Canada. B'nai B'rith Canada being a big fraternal organization, a little bit like Knights of Columbus, but probably of a more secular
Jewish. Lions.
But it's like sort of a Jewish organization, but more to the secular end of the spectrum. And the League of Human Rights was a big exponent of human rights for everybody, with a particular reference to the needs of Jews, a little bit like the ADL in the States. And we were big exponents of multiculturalism, big advocates for multiculturalism. But every year, for about 10 years in a row, the League would run a poll. They'd hire proper pollsters to test for anti-Semitic attitudes by asking a certain series of questions. Do Jews have too much power? Do they control all the banks? That kind of thing. Well, generally speaking, over that 10 years that I'm familiar with, the attitudes that were classed as potentially anti-Semitic ran about 10 or 15% of the population. Sometimes higher, sometimes lower. And they did not correlate with anti-Semitic behavior, except when Israel was in the news. And when Israel was in the news, anti-Semitic behavior would spike, but the attitudes would still remain relatively constant. What you touched on it, you said it, and I agree with it absolutely. What this war uniquely has done has made it permitted to exercise behavior that is just unacceptable, but it's become legitimate to exercise it. And that's extremely troubling. The other thing that's troubling is that in all probability, that 10 to 15% is significantly higher now than it was. And in no small measure, that's by legitimizing of the propaganda by people who should know better, the newspapers and the politicians.
I can't help but think, we already discussed voting and how it has impacted politicians' views. The business model of the news media has changed so much as well, where I think that's impacting as well the reporting of this issue. Where, for people that don't understand, or that might need a little more explanation, newspapers used to make the bulk of their money by selling advertising in their newspaper,
and especially want ads.
Want ads in particular. There was all sorts of ways. This was a huge revenue generator for papers. That's all but been completely obliterated. There's very little advertising in a newspaper compared to what there was 30, 40 years ago. Now, most news publications have moved online, and it's a pay-per-click model. So there is advertising on the page, but more it's a subscriber base.
Yes.
So people, where newspapers like, say, the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, even the National Post, all of them, where they make any money is when people click to subscribe. They actually pay for that subscription, and that's where the money's coming from. For that reason, you have to produce content that people want to read, not what they should read, but what they want to read. So it can become an echo chamber. So papers that once might have been more balanced are now simply producing content that excites their readers.
And associated with that, I think you're absolutely correct, but associated with that is the general decline in revenue that the newspapers have and all media basically have suffered, and consequently a reduced pool of reporters and investigators.
No, I don't argue that, but I guess my whole point would be, though, if I own a publication and the majority of my readers are anti-Israeli, I'm not going to call them anti-Semitic, but maybe they're against the state of Israel. So let's say they're all anti-Israeli and they are against Israel in this conflict, and I want to maintain them as subscribers. I need to continue to produce content that shows people the mistakes that Israel's making, rather than showing a balanced approach on both sides.
You're right. I just had this one little proviso. The newspaper doesn't know in advance what people want to read. It puts it out there and then waits to see if people buy the newspaper.
Oh, but it's much more curated today than it has ever been before.
Yeah.
And I would say that for all publications, like, sadly, news has become almost entirely editorial.
Right. I agree with that. And that's a problem.
I think the National Post is just as bad as this as, say, the Globe and Mail, for example, or the CBC. It's all editorial. It's all spin towards one side or the other. There's very little down the middle reporting anymore. And I think it's largely because of this subscriber base.
But you get into a problem by saying that, in that you tend to say, well, a pox on all their houses. And
well, no, I don't say that. What I do is I read them all to try to figure out where the balance is in the middle.
Yeah, somebody much smarter than me said there's a problem with that, because if the question is it raining outside? You don't listen to one guy who says yes and one guy who says no, and then try and figure out which one is correct. You stick your head out the window. Okay, and the problem is that we can't stick our head out the window if we on these issues, right? In a sense,
I can't look out at Israel. I have to trust the reporting.
That's true. That's quite true. Now the problem is, though, that bad reporting makes good reporting untrustworthy. And the New York Times is a perfect example. The New York Times is very, very heavily biased against Israel. And their articles are
that's why the Free Press was founded. They kicked Barry Weiss out.
Yes. But let me just say one thing. Because I can't trust the New York Times on Israel, about which I know a little, can I trust the New York Times about anything?
If I know you lie about this, how do I know that you're telling me the truth about this?
Exactly.
This is what's killed my faith in media. I tell this story a lot, but it's like, when I was a kid, Knowlton Nash and Lloyd Bridges were like my hero, and Peter Jennings. When they were on TV, everybody had to be quiet. My grandmother would hit you with a slipper if you went anywhere near the knob. You had to listen to Knowlton Nash, you had to, or Lloyd Bridges if you're a CTV versus a CBC. And what they said was gospel truth. You just you trusted them, and you believed in what they said. And I was a continuous news watcher and a CBC lover for years and years and years. But I caught them in a few lies.
Yeah.
And once you catch them in a lie, one of the first reasons was because of this Israeli conflict. Former Prime Minister Stephen Harper went to Israel, flew to Israel, met with Netanyahu, tried to work on a peace deal, tried to give whatever help he could. Only one news publication in all of Canada reported it. It was only the National Post that reported. I was like, that was when all of a sudden I realized there's lies by telling mistruths and there's lies by omission.
Yes.
And when the entire news media refuses to even mention the fact that a former prime minister visited Israel, that's when I knew suddenly, oh, wait a minute. If you lie to me about this, what else aren't you telling me about?
Exactly. You'll see the accusation very, very often from all sectors of society, Jews, non-Jews, politicians, Israel's losing the public relations war. You hear that all the time. And there is a sense in which that's absolutely correct, because the war is not, that particular war is not being fought on any sort of an even battleground. How could you win a public relations war when, for example, you have October 7th on one hand, and then the New York Times carrying on its front page pictures of a bunch of Arab or Gazan children allegedly killed by Israel?
They weren't comfortable putting a picture of the Israeli babies being murdered.
Yeah.
But they're okay with putting Gazan.
Exactly.
That seems unfair and biased.
True, but how could you win a war against that when the people you have to fight against are controlling your access to the public?
Well, this is it. And this is where the distrust of media comes from. And like I said, once I catch you in one lie, I have to look and see where else you're lying.
Absolutely.
And so that's why I just want to have conversations with people, because we can look at any conflict with all sorts of guys with a different view. And this is we're in a new world where the war is literally on everyone's phone. You got video of everything. If we had video of some of the previous battles in history,
why do you think Vietnam War was there was so much opposition to it? Because people were seeing it. It was the first one on TV.
It for the first time.
Yeah.
You know, I can't help but think of like a classic story is we hear often the phrase "Don't kill the messenger."
Yeah.
You know where that comes from?
No.
It comes from Alexander the Great.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Alexander the Great was pushing across the east, pushing east through Persia, and I forget the specific place, but there was one tiny island, just literally 100 or a couple hundred meters off of the coast, and they were taking the whole area. They wanted to make sure. Now the actual palace for this royalty was on this island, and Alexander the Great, who we call the Great again, that's how he was viewed. He sends his emissaries to say, "Listen, we don't really want to fight. We'd like to simply, have you surrender." This was their diplomacy. He sent his emissaries to do that. Please surrender. We won't have to fight, and you'll become part of the Greek Empire. Well, they murder them, and they send their heads back to Alexander the Great. They killed the messenger.
Yeah. Okay.
So what they do now? So what they do after that? Alexander the Great is so disgusted and so angered by this that he brings his entire team of engineers to start transporting rocks down a mountainside to create a road / bridge all the way to this island. They spend months and months and months building this road. And then they slaughtered the entire island. There wasn't a man, woman, or child left living, as the history says.
Yeah.
Imagine if that was on videotape.
Right. Yes.
Imagine if that was on videotape.
Yeah.
And yet this is someone we call Alexander the Great.
Yeah.
Well, so perception is always important.
Right.
And now we've got so much videotape. It's not telling the whole story. It's showing just one side.
That's right. That's absolutely right. And the other thing,
or the other side for that matter, we're not getting this balance.
no, the other thing that I saw over the past week or 10 days during this war was AI created propaganda.
Oh, AI is changing the game for everything.
Yeah, you can still tell, I think, or at least I feel I can tell still if it's AI or reality. They show pictures of huge explosions in Tel Aviv, which I know didn't happen, but they look pretty real, but not perfect. But it's going to be a time when that is going to become a propaganda tool.
This technology is in its infancy.
Yeah.
So saying you can still tell the difference. Well, you can tell the difference between a Model T and a 2025 Ferrari. There's a significant difference, right? As we move forwards,
it's going to be less and less.
It's going to be, I don't know how we'll be able to tell.
Yeah.
So this search for truth continues to find the trusted sources.
Yeah. And ultimately, I mean, there is right and wrong in the world. You just have to find it sometimes. And
well, that's another thing that we're continuing to fight against here. People that are more conservative minded, like you and I, believe in right and wrong.
Yes.
There's a big push on the left that for moral relativism.
Oh, absolutely.
Moral relativism is there is no right, there is no wrong. There's only what you've been told.
Yeah. When I was in university, I do remember this. They used to say one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, right? And that's just wrong. I mean,
I would agree, but I'm telling you that at least 50% of our population would say no. It is
I think you're correct, and it's a source of pessimism.
And it comes again. The other thing I think it comes from is living in a secular world.
Yeah,
in a world without God, there is no right or wrong. Yeah. If you have no faith to lean on, what's right and what's wrong, and who would tell you?
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. Yeah.
And as we live in a secular society, people would say, well, if you're oppressed, there's no longer right or wrong. There's oppressor and oppressed.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But in part, it's, I have this certain regret that the advocacy for multiculturalism was correct as far as it went, but wasn't thought out fully enough. Yes, multiculturalism is absolutely required. It's necessary. But
in a country like ours.
Yeah, but what is multiculturalism? It should be respect, politeness, equal opportunity, and such like. But it does not mean that a person coming here shouldn't share the pre-existing values.
Well, in a world without God, what are those values?
Yeah.
And this is what happened. So when Justin Trudeau was prime minister, what makes us Canadian?
Yeah.
And he couldn't answer.
No, and some people say OHIP or, the healthcare. It's nonsense.
It is. It's absolute nonsense. And we should all rally we should all rally underneath the maple leaf. We should all stand strong for Canada as one. You can maintain your Jewish values. I can maintain my Catholic values. We rally below the maple leaf.
Absolutely. The key to it, I think, is understanding what's the private sphere and what's the public sphere, and having absolute respect for another's private sphere is necessary. I mean, that's the basic thing. But when that private sphere includes, I get to change you, or I get to change this country into something radically different, that's when I think a line is crossed.
Well, that's interesting coming from a constitutional expert like yourself.
Yeah. Well, I spent years arguing that charters of rights were not necessarily a good thing. It's much more complicated.
It has created a lot of complication, I think.
Well, the charters of rights, the main objection to it, in my mind, is that it politicizes the judicial system, and it moralizes political activity. So what I mean by that is this. There are questions of, did this guy murder this guy? Okay, that's what I call a black and white, yes and no, right or wrong question.
Yes.
Then, should abortion be permitted or not be permitted? Whatever your thoughts on that. I think you have to admit that it's a political question. I understand from the Catholic point of view and from many religious Jews' point of view, it's a right or wrong question. But in the modern world, most people look at it as a political question. What's the best answer? What's the worst answer? A better example might be language rights in Quebec. They're not tied necessarily fundamentally to a person's individual personality, but it's something that the government could legitimately control. The problem is, once the court has said this is constitutional, it is not a breach of the charter, the general public tend to think that's necessarily correct. It is right, not better, not, okay, that's the decision we're going to make in a compromised world where we need to make compromises. No, it becomes inviolable. Okay, it becomes unchangeable. And in
spite of the fact of what the majority may.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. The whole point of the charter is to constrain the majority. That's the point of it. And how do you constrain the majority better than by having a tiny little judicial minority make the decision?
Who gets to decide?
Yeah, so that the politicians continually boot questions onto the courts that they should take the rap for trying to decide. And you see it more and more now that the people tend to mimic that. We're going to take you to court if you do this. Well, the bike lanes in Toronto.
Yeah.
What nonsense is this? That's a judicial question? It's a purely political question.
100%.
Are bike lanes good or bike lanes bad? The court should not be dealing with issues like that.
Not at all. I'm fully in agreement with you.
But once you get a constitutionalized charter of rights, everybody's going to try and make use of it, the politicians and the people. And it is necessary that the politicians and the people have a certain conception of rights and a willingness to afford them to others. But it's not going to work if you only look at a piece of paper for your source and you try and push and push and push to the farthest extreme.
And I think that's what a lot of Canadians are feeling right now.
Yeah.
They're feeling pushed and pushed.
Yes.
Things are being rammed down their throats so fast they can't take it.
Yeah.
It's like I've lived in this country my whole life. Now suddenly I feel like there's a new set of rules that I have to live by.
Yeah.
And I don't understand them, and I don't know when know when we agreed upon all this. Like, oh, we didn't agree upon this. One judge or a panel of 11 judges in Ottawa decided that this was the way things are.
I mean, it's a terrible mistake to think that everything was rosy back then, and it is not now. I mean, the desegregation process in the United States forced a lot of people to suddenly wake up, and they would likely have said, "Well, what happened to our world?" But they were just wrong. They were wrong in those days, and they needed to be corrected.
Yes.
Now we're, I think, not perfect by any means. This is not a perfect country, but I think in many ways we're striving to be better than people did. We're more conscious of the need.
There's no such thing as a perfect country.
Yeah. But
show me a country that's better than Canada or the United States. Show me a place that's more worth living.
Well, personally, I'm kind of split with Israel, but
well, I can't. I personally would live in Canada 100%. Yeah, 100 out of 100 times.
Yeah, and Canada may have its faults, but it is a wonderful place to live. And if you stop thinking about necessarily right and wrong, best and worst, and start thinking in terms of better and not as good, then I think you can make a more rational impression. There are things going on in the States at the moment, to the extent I understand them from the news, which may not be great.
Again, reporting we can't be certain of, right?
Yeah, that are really quite frightening. But who knows if they're really...
And again, it's extremely regional in a massive country.
Right.
If you speak to people in Florida, people are flocking to Florida. People are flocking to Texas.
Right. Yeah.
They're seeing massive inflows into both of these states, right?
Yeah.
New York seems to be emptying out.
Well, I think if this guy becomes
San Francisco
mayor,
as well. Yeah, in San Francisco as well.
Yeah.
It was more people left the city of San Francisco than any other city. I read that this morning, actually.
Really? Okay.
In the last decade. There's been a mass exodus,
Yeah.
and that's the most progressive city in the
Yeah.
whole country, or in their whole country.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
we got so far off the topic here.
Well, it doesn't matter.
That's part of the fun, though.
But the issues are the same worldwide, or sorry, in the Western world, and Israel is most definitely part of the Western world.
Agreed.
Call it the Western world with an accent. You know, in the way that Italy is a Western world with an accent. You know,
I would say German. I would include Germany, Italy, Greece, France.
Yeah.
These are all Western society.
Right. With various different accents and impressions. Yeah.
Precise.
Absolutely.
I'm not, and I think Israel is as well.
Yeah.
Now, going forward, we're at a point now where the United States has now dropped bombs on Iran's nuclear facilities. Most reporting seems to show that they have destroyed Iran's nuclear capability, at least for a while going forward. How do you see things unfolding over the next few months? We're in a ceasefire as we speak, technically.
Okay, so the only existing ceasefire is between Israel and Iran. There's an understanding between Israel and Lebanon that if Hezbollah moves north of the Litani River, which it's not doing, and stops trying to get ready for the next war with Israel.
Well, all their leaders have been obliterated.
Yeah, but there's
people moving up, but it takes your best leaders, your best thought leaders are gone.
Yeah, they're very weak.
Yes.
They're very, very weak, but they're still a threat. The Houthis are still an active war situation, and Gaza is still an active war situation. There's still 50 hostages left, of whom about 24 are thought to be alive, and the rest are bodies. And that war fell off the news reporting because of the Iranian thing, which was much more dramatic. But it'll come back, and there'll be more anti-Israel stuff in the press very quickly. What I'm really, really hoping, and what I see signs of potential, is that Syria and Lebanon, the current governments of each, will continue with what they've been actually doing, if not necessarily saying, in the past several months. And that is controlling and trying to eliminate foreign armies on their territory. So the Syrians are doing a better job of it than Lebanon, so it appears. And if they could be induced to really make an effort at that and join the Abraham Accords, that would be a huge step forward.
And that's what you're sort of praying for.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that if Syria were to do that, and especially if Lebanon would just up its game, just a little bit, and make it a little bit more obvious that it's really trying to control Hezbollah, I think that would have an important knock-on effect for Hamas. Hamas has no allies attempting to help it other than the Houthis. And the Houthis are genocidally minded, but largely incapable. They have these huge rockets that do reach.
And
Israel.
The Houthis are in Yemen, for those who don't know.
Thousands of miles away.
And they've been fighting a massive proxy war in Yemen for the last, 8 years?
Oh, I think it's more than that.
See,
it's a revolution. The Houthis it's a civil war, rather.
Yeah.
And the Houthis control the north, and the legitimate government controls the south. The Saudis got involved on behalf of the legitimate government for a few years and then decided to back up.
It was sort of a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran.
Yes, fought there, and the Houthis were succeeding. So Saudi Arabia backed out. I've seen statistics that say 500,000 people have starved to death in Yemen. And
I don't know why it doesn't get more publicity. It's one of the most painful things to read about and see.
Okay, but from my perspective, it's very, very obvious why it doesn't get more publicity. And I'm going to say it. It doesn't get more publicity because Jews didn't cause it to happen or can't be blamed for it.
This is Shia versus Sunni. This is an Islamic war.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Or maybe leftist versus rightist. I don't know. I don't pretend to know. All I know is that huge numbers of people have starved to death, and the world doesn't care. And It keeps coming back to me about this Greta Thunberg and her little flotilla. Okay, I mean, it's almost a joke, but it really, there's a serious cognitive dissonance amongst these people's heads. She refused to see the film of the atrocities on October 7th on the grounds it's propaganda. How do you deal with a mindset like that?
Well, that's so. I'm not saying that you have all the solutions by any means, not or that there are all the solutions are even available. But does the Jewish population of Canada and the Israeli population change the hearts and minds of people in this country and across Western? Is it possible?
In my time, when I was I guess in my late teens, it was really popular to be Jewish and to be Israeli because they'd won the Six-Day War, and the October War, October 73, hadn't yet happened. Okay, so Israel was still the plucky little victim, and it was really popular. Eaton's had an Israel Day fashion show one year. I remember that because I was stock boy at that stage. But my point is that things fluctuate. And as soon as the oppressor-oppressee mentality became much more current in the 70s and 80s and so on, it becomes impossible to change that. So more and more people like Netanyahu and many Israeli politicians and many Jews are saying, okay, screw it. We're just not interested. Okay, we're just going to do what's necessary.
Become more isolationist and do what you need to do.
Not necessarily isolationist, more self-protective and not reliant on goodwill from other people. If you want to give goodwill, so much the better. It's our due. But just as goodwill towards a Black or a Chinese person is due, it's their right as a human being. If you want to give it, great, it's accepted. If you don't, I'm going to carry on anyway. And I think that's the radicalization that's happening in many aspects of the Jewish population since October 7th because of the world's reaction to October 7th and what we've seen since then. So,
have you ever read the historian and economist Thomas Sowell?
Not that I recall. No.
He's a professor emeritus at Stanford University and a member of the Hoover Institute. I recommend you look him up. He's brilliant. Really.
S-O-L-E?
S-O-W-E-L-L.
Oh, okay. Sowell. Okay.
And Sowell writes an entire book on this, to paraphrase it and to put it into one small sentence. It's the world hates successful minorities.
Yes. Yeah.
He has an entire book on this, but he'll make the parallels between not just of the Jewish people, but also the South Chinese, the Armenian peoples, any group of people that are a successful minority. In the end, he states basically that the only way in which the Jews can succeed to win the hearts and minds of others would be to become unsuccessful.
Okay, I got to talk to you about a book. The name of the author will come to me shortly, but it's Everybody Loves Dead Jews.
Oh, wow. That's a pretty harsh title.
Oh, yeah. But she documents it and demonstrates that there are so many memorials to dead Jews amongst people who won't support living Jews. Okay. So there's a Chinese city that years and years and years ago, well before the revolution, was created, inhabited by a huge percentage of Jews. They were all chased out after because of the war. Many Jews fled from Germany and Poland,
all the way to Asia.
Oh yeah, we could go on about hours. Yeah, Asia was a relatively friendly. Even Japan, areas controlled by Japan.
Really,
it's just fascinating. One of the theories of why Japan refused anti-Jewish activity at the request of the Nazis was because they believed that Jews controlled the world. I mean, that's a theory. There's some evidence. It doesn't matter. The point is that there's this Chinese city that they chased all the Jews out after the revolution. But now they've recreated it, and they've recreated these museums of these old dead Jews that they had there. Anne Frank House in Amsterdam is a perfect example.
Mhm.
Here's a dead Jew that they're lauding about, but in the Netherlands, you got all these riots going on at the same time, and she's got example after example of that.
The world loves dead Jews.
No, everybody loves dead
Everybody loves dead Jews.
Jews. Yeah,
Okay, I'm gonna have to look that book up.
yeah. It's a fascinating read, and I'm sorry I just can't remember her.
It's
her
okay.
name.
I'll look it up. I'll find
Yeah,
it.
but anyway, it goes back to, I think, what you were saying. The one wrinkle, I haven't read this whole book. I will look it up.
Mhm.
The one wrinkle is that if you look at the historical criticisms of Jews, you get the anti-Semitic canards. They're too rich, they're too controlling, but you also, they're poor vermin who are going to bring illnesses and such like to our cities. So, you can't win. You can't win. But certainly overly successful minorities do attract problems. Hutterites in the West, in the prairies,
Yeah.
Another example. It's a good theory.
Well, I'll share it with you at a later date. Is there anything else before we wrap up today that you want to make sure that everybody knows? Something that we didn't talk about that you were maybe you hoped I'd ask
I
you
would
about.
like to make a pitch for tourism. Basically, I really do understand that non-Jews would feel uncertain about going to Israel just at this particular moment. Logistically, there's still huge problems of getting there because there are so many people that were stranded when the airlines were shut down. But it's a wonderful, friendly place. Risks of terrorism and political violence are much, much less than the risks of being in ordinary traffic. Okay, if you've survived traffic in Italy, you'll survive traffic in Israel, and I guarantee you'll survive anything any of the bad guys would want to throw at you.
Oh.
It's a historic place. It's a modern place. It's a future place. It's well worth a visit. And you don't need to worry about not knowing Hebrew. If you're in the tourist world, almost everybody speaks English.
Well, I'm going to have to take you up on that someday if you're not
I got
careful.
a spare bedroom.
Yeah, again, we've already determined that. Simon, thanks so much for coming today. I've really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you very much.
I feel like I've been enlightened quite a bit on some of the things that are going on. Hopefully we can have you on again as things.
Oh, sure.
If anything happens, maybe we can have you come on and talk more.
Be a pleasure.
I really enjoyed this conversation, and I want to wish you a great day. Thanks to everybody for tuning in.
Thank you very much.
Have a great weekend. We'll take care.
All the best.
Bye-bye.